Game 4 of the Women's World Chess Championship coming your way very soon. So we have the champion, the title holder, Wenjun, playing against the challenger Lei Tingjie. First 3 games drawn. Very tense indeed. Let's see what happens here. So this time, Wenjun playing white. And it follows the first few moves of game 2. So from this position, it can lead to all kinds of things. Bishop e7, Queen's Gambit declined. We had c5 played in game 2. But this time, Lei plays d takes c4, which allows white to move forward in the center with e4. And here the most popular move is bishop to b4. But instead, we have b5 from Lei. And this is a continuation which 10 years ago was unheard of. It's incredible how, the last few years, with the aid of strong computers, completely new variations have developed. So the pawn on c4 is protected. If knight takes pawn, then the pawn on e4 can be taken, getting rid of one of those important centre pawns. So white plays e5, attacking the knight, which moves to d5. And only then white takes the pawn on b5. Now, at first glance, this looks rotten for black because you can see that black is now saddled with these three pawns on the queen side that don't protect each other. They look terrible. And it feels like just a matter of time before this bishop is going to take the pawn on c4, for example. But here is where black plays knight b6. And incredibly, black's position is actually okay here. And, there have been, as I said, in the last 10 years, a lot of games played starting from this position. So what compensation has black got for these appalling queenside pawns? Well, that pawn on c4 is actually very useful if black can hold it, because it prevents white's bishop moving to this really important diagonal. The other thing is that this long diagonal will be really nice for that bishop. And also, black has control over the pawn over the square on d5, which is a natural home for a knight, possibly a bishop, maybe even a queen, you never know. Having said that, these pawns aren't beautiful, and that pawn on e5 potentially gives white some room to attack on the king side, using that square. So a well-known spearhead. Bishop e2. So the knight comes out to c6, and that knight wants to hop in here and then back to d5 very often. White castles and bishop e7. And this is, you could say, almost a starting point to this variation, actually, because here is where white has to decide on how to place the pieces for the middle game. Probably the sharpest move for white here is to play queen d2 with the idea queen f4 and queen g4. Feels to me that with that pawn on e5, carving out territory on the king side, that really white should be attacking on that side of the board, and to shift the queen over to the king side is a first step in that direction. And that has been seen a lot. I can think of some fantastic games. Ding Liren won an incredible game against Duda with queen f4. But, well, black has resources there. And the other way to play is more steadily with bishop e3. And this was played by Wenjun. Castles, and then the knight came back to c3. Well, the knight wasn't doing much on b5 anyway. It comes back very sensibly. Looking at these squares. Rook b8, semi-open file. The rook could very well be usefully placed there. And here, Zhu went for b3, just getting rid of that pawn, which potentially makes it easier to build up some pressure on this diagonal. Another way of playing is a3, as Mamedyarov, for example, has done, followed by queen c2. So that stops the knight coming to b4, and then you play your rook into the middle. It's just another way of playing. But b3, and pawns are exchanged, and bishop b7. Well, that exchange of pawns has, as I mentioned, allowed potentially white to use the d3 square and perhaps to get some pressure on this diagonal. It also means that the a file is opened, so the rook on a1 comes into play. Queen b1. So there we go. That queen is looking down the diagonal, and somehow that's quite a logical move. And indeed, this has previously turned out very well. So, for example, there was a game between Sargsyan and Masoud Lu that went rook a8, and now queen e4. This is really important if white is going to attack, to switch that queen over. And after this, well, already white has a very dangerous attack, and this worked out extremely well for white. Yeah, you can see white's piece is pointing in this direction, and yeah, very nice position for white. But Lei had obviously come to the board very well prepared. She was moving really quickly, and it took her just seconds to play this move, which is an improvement. Knight b4, and that means that the queen can't transfer to the king side, because now the e4 square is covered. Knight e4 played. So that's a logical move. And another reason for putting the queen on b1, supporting the knight. And that knight has interesting possibilities. And this has been seen before. And previously we've seen, for example, a6, just making sure that white isn't going to take there. But this gives white a really pleasant initiative. So these squares have been weakened, and white plays in classic fashion h4 and h5, and that's dangerous. Black has to be very careful there. But instead of that, Lei played an improvement, h6, preventing the knight coming to g5. And again, this is obviously prepared. She spent very little time over this, but it's a pawn sacrifice. Rook takes a7. But it's a decent one, because this knight has been restricted, and actually the important thing is for black, to stop any pressure on the king side and to get nice squares for those minor pieces. So now there's potential for black sometimes to take this, so the bishop just stepped back, and it also keeps an eye on the knight, which came back, attacking the rook, which came back down, and now the other knight went to b4, because now the knight on c6 attacks the d4 pawn. So that was defended with the bishop, and the knight came back to d5. So, I mean, black is basically saying, I'm happy with the draw, because if bishop d2, then the position will repeat. But Zhu decides to play on. She thought for almost 20 minutes over this next move. Bishop c1. So just a little bit different. And that means that if this knight hops back here, then, for example, this pawn could be defended with the rook. So rook a8 played, and so this is on the 20th move, and this was the first really proper think from Lei. So round about this point, clearly her preparation was coming to an end. She obviously realised that, yep, this is playable, I have good compensation, but now she really needs to think things through very carefully. Rook d1 played, supporting the d-pawn. And pieces are exchanged. And then this knight came back to b4. So, I mean, black is just holding the position very steadily. And it's actually very difficult for either side to make progress here, because black has such a solid grip in the centre. And notice that these pawns prevent this knight from getting into the position. It's curious. Anyway, knight c5 played. Well, it's a good position for the knight, but there's certainly no need to take it. Bishop c6. Yeah, that knight, I mean, if that pawn weren't on e5, excuse me, you could throw the knight into e5, and, you know, that actually looks quite attractive. But, yeah, it's very hard for either side to do anything. Bishop d2, a little bit of pressure. So it's very tight manoeuvring. Queen b8 looks really sensible, supporting the knight. And you never know when it could be useful to attack that pawn. And you never know, sometimes you might be able to exchange off the light square bishop as well. And here, Queen a5 from Zhu. And now Rook d8 was played, which seems a bit funny. I mean, Queen b6 feels absolutely right. I mean, the Queen is on a nice square on a5, so why not just exchange it off straight away? And this exchange attacks the knight, and then the rook can come to a8. I don't think black has any difficulties there at all. Excellent compensation for the pawn. Those knights are looking fantastic. I mean, all black's pieces look good. So slightly surprising that Lei declined to play that. Oh, incidentally, there's an important tactic. White would very much like to support the queen with rook a1, but then rook a8 is a nasty skewer. But instead rook d8 played, which, yeah, I mean, of course it's a reasonable square for the rook, but there was no need to play it. Rook c1 played, okay, looks reasonable, looking down this semi-open file. And now queen b6. Well, it's still a good move in this position. This is exchanged off, and white really doesn't have much better. And knight a6. So we've reached an endgame. White is still a pawn up, but black has decent compensation. So there's threats here, so bishop comes back to b7. Now, if white starts exchanging here, then black is just very comfortable. The knight comes back to d5. You can see all these entry squares for the rook are covered. And in the meantime, what exactly is white doing? You know, this knight I mentioned earlier, it's restricted by the pawns. These are, you know, the extra pawn, but actually it limits the range of the knight. This is the problem. And black's pieces look very good. It's also sometimes the idea to activate this rook on the a file. Now, instead of that, Zhu played knight c7. Well, that's not going to be exchanged. That's good for white, attacking both those. So g5, just claiming a bit of territory on the king side, giving the king a little bit more room, and perhaps with this idea. And indeed, that happened. h3, yep, gives the king a square and also stops that one. Knight f4, good idea. Why not claim one of those bishops? White has to give one of them up. Moving the bishop certainly doesn't look like a good idea in view of this, and rook takes d4. So best thing is to eliminate that knight. Now black has the two bishops. Now we know this one is really powerful. At the moment, the dart squared bishop doesn't look like it's playing much of a role in the game, but actually it has real potential as well, as we're going to see. So this knight is a little bit stranded, so it came back. And bishop c6. King f1. Yeah, the king is a slight problem. Somehow, if some pieces were exchanged and this king could find itself on d3, protecting that d-pawn, well, that's a dream. That's an absolute dream. It's not going to happen. And the king's a little bit restricted on f1, actually. King f8. I think it was played. I think I'd probably prefer king g7. But king f8 doesn't really change much in the position. Rook d1. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an indication that actually white is kind of short of a plan here. Rook a8. Good move. Activating the rook on the a file. Knight c3, so that knight covers some squares, and knight a2. This is going to allow this rook into the game. In some ways, I'm sure that Zhu was pleased to exchange pieces because it's quite tricky for white actually. But black would also be pleased that this rook has activated. So white's still a pawn up, but black has excellent compensation in the form of the two bishops and that active rook. And yeah, this is the extra pawn. What can you actually do with that? Very little. Knight e1 played. Here, Lei plays rook b2. But there's a little maneuver which really appeals for me instead of that. And this is what I call a starfish bishop. You've heard of the good old octopus knight. But this is a starfish bishop. So that bishop, supported by the rook, actually really controls that rook. It can't move to c1. Obviously can't move to e1 either. And white's pieces are in a bit of a bind there. Of course, black is not better in this position. But I just think it's excellent compensation. And yeah, if white actually goes wrong here, it could be better for black. But yeah, it really appeals to me. Also just keeps the king out of the game as well. But instead, rook b2 was played, which looks entirely natural. But it does allow this knight to enter the game now. Knight d3 and knight takes f4. So I think Zhu would have been sighing a bit of a sigh of relief actually once that knight has got into the game. But still, black has these two bishops and sufficient compensation for the pawn. Bishop a3, so that bishop could well come here. Might be nice to attack the pawn. So Zhu pushes on and forcing exchange. So white is making a little something of this kingside pawn majority. We've now got 4 pawns against 2, and they're pretty regular. Bishop c5. Okay, but black is also absolutely fine in this position. Those bishops are really impressive in combination with a rook. Rook and bishops often a really efficient duo. Knight f6. Rook b2. Well, you can see how difficult it is for white to do anything here with the rook attacking the bishop and looking through at these pawns as well. f4. Yeah, well, trying to get things rolling. But white's king doesn't look very clever on the back rank. Rook b4 attacks the pawn. g3, and now rook b3 attacking that one. Yeah, difficult for white to hold everything together here. If bishop b3, bishop d3, sorry, then rook b2 doesn't look very nice. So Zhu and Wenjun made a practical decision to give a check, allowing the exchange. So now we've got opposite coloured bishops on the board, which increases the drawing chances. And rook takes g3, and now pawns are level as well. White is still a little bit better because these pawns have some potential. By this stage, the clock times had evened up. Earlier in the game, Lei, with this excellent preparation, had a pretty big time advantage. But things had switched around by this stage, and actually Lei was running short of time. So, little bit tricky. Rook e3 is a good start. Just making sure the f-pawn doesn't advance. King g2, king comes forward. Bishop e7. Got to watch out for an attack on that f7 pawn sometimes. Rook b7. Yeah. Make sure that pawn isn't running. And here, well, yeah, running short of time. It's still not easy to defend this position with black. And Lei makes a risky decision here. It kind of raises the stakes a bit. It doesn't... I don't think it's not a blunder. Yeah, it just raises the stakes. She plays f6, allowing that pawn to advance. So now it starts getting tricky. There's not a lot of margin for error now for black. I think this is a very nice move instead. You could play bishop h4. Now this is very hard to see that this is kind of a positional draw. But I think this is an excellent move. If rook takes pawn, then rook g3 check. King here, and then rook here, with the idea of bishop g3 and bishop takes f4. And yeah, something like this, for example, those exchanges and just guarantee the draw really once this pawn duo has been broken. And if rook b4, protecting that one, just rook e3, preventing this one rolling forward. It's very hard to see how white can do anything in that position. But, you know, when you're running short of time, these kind of positional moves with a kind of blockade, it's very hard to know how secure they are. You know, there could be some little move of white that sort of upsets things. But I think that's a really nice position with the rook and bishop really dominating the king, actually. But f6, it's not a mistake, but it certainly raises the stakes in the position. But Lei actually plays extremely well. If this pawn is taken, then rook takes pawn. So bishop f5 forced. h4, that gives the rook a little foothold on g3. And bishop g4, the bishop comes back. Check. Here, another check. King e2 might have been the best chance here. I mean, black is still okay. As long as that rook stays behind the pawn, then everything should be okay. King f1, bishop e7. And if rook takes b6, then you can play f5. And that's okay for black. Exchanging more pawns. Should be okay. You know, that could be tested. But king e2, rook b3 protects the pawn. f5. So supporting the pawn, and now that bishop has, well, potentially the freedom to move away to perhaps one of these squares. b5, good defense. Play actively. And I mean, really what white wants to do here is to check and play the rook here. Let's just see what would happen. There's a problem though. After bishop c5, you can see the rook is able to check here. e7, rook e3, going behind that pawn, and black is absolutely fine. That pawn will be taken. So that's why the king was shuffled across. b4. Okay, the pawn advancing. Well, that could be interesting. And now Zhu goes for it with a rook e8. So what's the difference? Okay, have a think here. How would you play with black? I'll have a slurp of tea. You have a little think. Cheers. Black to play and draw. What's the correct move? You're running short of time. How are you going to draw this for black? You can either play bishop d6 or bishop c5. One draws and one loses. Which one are you going to go for? If bishop c5, that's game over. e7, threatening to play rook here. And if rook e3, which seems like it's going to hold, then rook c8 breaks black's coordination. So if bishop takes pawn, you can snaffle the rook, and if rook takes pawn, then you take the bishop. Game over. However, bishop d6 is different, played by Lei. Because in this case, if e7, check, and the rook goes behind the pawn, and this bishop is safe. And there is no way through for white. In fact, b3 check is coming soon, so white even has to be a little bit careful there. But that draws the game. So after bishop d6, Zhu played rook d8, attacking the bishop, which came to e7, and they repeated the position. There is nothing better for white here. Draw by threefold repetition. So the fourth game has ended in a draw. Excellent opening preparation from Lei Tingjie. Zhu, I think, can be reasonably happy that by the end she was pressing a little bit, but actually pretty decent defense from Lei. So yeah, both parties can be satisfied, but I think things are starting to loosen up a little bit with their opening choices. This was a more daring choice from Lei Tingjie. So there we go. 4 draws in the first 4 games. Remember, do click that subscribe button to get instant notification for new vids. Free day on Monday. 5th game takes place on Tuesday. Thanks for watching.